You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. As someone who has been reading the Bible for, over 2 decades now, I can say with absolute confidence that the second half of Exodus chapter 4 is one of the strangest passages in the entirety of Scripture. I mean, it's definitely top 3 to 5, for sure. And a lot of people, even Christians who frequently read their Bibles, don't seem to know that this passage is here. And that's probably because it's not often preached because of how difficult it is. There's a lot of uncertainty revolving around even the characters involved in this part of the story, the motivations behind their actions, and why their actions work. So we're going to be talking about an impromptu circumcision, some really awkward family relations, and what this all tells us about God's expectations for the new leader of his people. This is going to be a wild ride of an episode. We're back in Exodus chapter 4, and no pun intended on the insensitive subject matter, but as always, it will be uncut and unfiltered. Last week we left off at the end of God's dialogue with Moses on Mount Sinai. He has commissioned Moses to go back, gather the elders of the people, show them these signs, take them to Pharaoh, and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. We've covered Moses' objections to each of God's points, God's counterpoints to him, and God's very brief outbreak of anger against Moses. So where we left off, God had said that Aaron, his brother, would come to meet him and work with him as a mouthpiece between Moses and God to Pharaoh and to the Israelite people. So starting off in verse 18. Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me go, I pray you, and return to my family which is in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And Yahweh said to Moses in Midian, "Go, return to Egypt, for all the men are dead who sought your life." Moses took his wife and his sons, and set them upon a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And Yahweh said to Moses, "When you go to return into Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put into your hand. But I will harden his heart, and he will not let the people go. And thus you will say to Pharaoh, Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, look, I will slay your son, your firstborn." Alright, let's pause there before we get into the really funky part of the chapter so we can get a little bit of the idea of what's going on here. When verse 18 reads that Moses returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, if you remember back from a few episodes ago in the series, we talked through the many names of Moses' father-in-law. And believe it or not, here's another one. Although this reads as Jethro in many English versions, it's actually a different Hebrew word behind the name. It's the Hebrew name Yeter, and it shows up only 9 times in the entirety of the Tanakh. Frustratingly, this is the only time it is translated as Jethro, because it is not the name Jethro, or title, depending on what you think Jethro is. Go back a few episodes to find out what I mean there if you didn't listen. The other 8 times it is transliterated as Jether, and these are mostly in 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles in lists of genealogies. There is no J letter in Hebrew, so a lot of times when you have a name beginning with Y in Hebrew, it gets anglicized with a J in English. So the Hebrew name here is Yeter, but it's often brought over as Jether, as we would say in English. It does not mean Jethro, so this is technically yet another name we have for Jethro, for Moses' father-in-law. This is a good example of how all translations work with some bias to them. They all have a theological bent, and sometimes they'll diverge a bit from a more literal translation in order to smooth out what they see as possible contradictions so that English readers aren't thrown off by that. And while that's a noble idea, I think it stopped serving any purpose once the average person gained access to the original languages. It may have worked 100 years ago when the average person couldn't necessarily look at the Hebrew behind it and see this as a different name, but now that we have Bible software that is accessible to anyone and relatively easy to use, the average person can just look at this, or possibly another translation or a commentary, and say, that's not actually accurate. So while I appreciate that the translators of the King James wanted to lean into the faith of their readers and try to bolster that, I think what they did was actually counterproductive, because the Bible is a complex document, and smoothing out its rough edges just to make it appear to be more coherent than it is counterproductive. So in this particular instance, whether the issue was maybe a textual thing where a scribe miscopied Jethro's name or title, or maybe this was yet another name or title that Moses' father-in-law had, we don't know. But this is yet another name for him. And the weird family dynamics don't stop there. In fact, there's some rare familial terminology used in this chapter, starting right here with the word for father-in-law that is used to describe Jethro in this verse. It's the Hebrew word koten, and it is used almost entirely in the Tanakh of Jethro. I'm not sure we need to make too much of that, but I would say it's probably just because there aren't that many female major characters in the biblical story, so there's not really a need to talk about father-in-laws too often. Moses' request to him to let me go, I pray you, is certainly a foreshadowing of his future demand to let my people go when he speaks to Pharaoh. Robert Alter jumps in here in his translation commentary and says, in the very next verse, God will give Moses assurance that he no longer is in danger of execution for the act of manslaughter. The last clause here is a pointed allusion to Joseph's anxious question to his brothers about whether his father is still alive. And he's referring to where Moses says, let me go back to Egypt, see whether my family is yet still alive. Alter continues, the familial bond that induced Joseph to bring his father and brothers down to Egypt will now be manifested in Moses' actions as he sets out to reverse the process, bringing his brothers, if you will, out of Egypt and back to Canaan. His wondering whether his brothers still live is more than a way of saying that he wants to find out how they're faring, because he is aware that they have been the target of a genocidal plan. End quote. Now, verse 19 is a little weird, because God was speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses has left the mountain, and now he's with his father-in-law Jethro. And verse 19 jumps in and says, Yahweh said to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. So we're not told, is this a second appearance of Yahweh to Moses? Is this part of his conversation with Moses on Sinai that just got cut off and put here instead? We don't know. The biblical texts aren't always chronological. Sometimes they'll throw in things that seem to be a little bit out of order because it's more thematic. In our Western mindset, we're used to a very linear storytelling process with a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end. Whereas in an ancient Near Eastern mindset for storytelling, it's a little bit more cyclical. We talked about this a bit in our Ecclesiastes series, where Koheleth, the speaker in Ecclesiastes, frequently talked about the cycles of life. And I would argue that's almost a better way of viewing life, because sure, we have a start to our lives, our lives as a whole in the middle, and then eventually an end, but there are a lot of patterns that repeat throughout our lifetimes. We have cycles that we go through. So this is just something where we have to set aside a little bit of our modern Western ideas of how to tell a story, and we have to think more like a Chris Nolan movie, where time is not linear and some details may end up in slightly weird places. With verse 20, I want to pick up again my frequent refrain to encourage you to read the text attentively, because it reads that Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey. Why? That's a really weird detail when you stop and think about it. It's so easy to just read over these verses and not think anything about that because it's not a significant detail. But it is a detail. And especially when you have a detail like this that doesn't really make a difference for the story, like who cares how Moses and his family got to Egypt, whether they rode on a donkey, a horse, walked, or took a cab? Like, what difference does it make? Well, maybe not a ton for this particular narrative itself. However, this is where the idea of hyperlinks in the Bible come together, and this is so cool. I love this sort of thing, because whenever you have this kind of little standout detail that just doesn't quite seem to fit, it's almost guaranteed that the biblical authors were trying to clue you in to a connection to some other passage. And once you figure out what that passage is, we need to see how we can read this passage that we're in now in light of the one that we were hyperlinked back to. And it just so happens that the last time someone in the biblical story was seen riding a donkey, it was in Abraham's test on Mount Moriah with Isaac and sacrificing his son there. So I think the implication by including this little detail of Moses' family riding on a donkey is that Moses, like Abraham, is now entering into a test since the last one didn't go so hot. There's kind of a funky little addition in Targum Jonathan that I just wanted to throw in here. I've mentioned a few times on the podcast, the Targums are Aramaic translation slash commentary slash imaginative retellings of the biblical story. And this is this particular verse in Targum Jonathan. And Moshe, that's the Hebrew version of Moses, Moshe took his wife and his sons and made them ride on the ass and returned to the land of Mitzrayim. That's the Hebrew word for Egypt. Don't ask me how we got from Mitzrayim to Egypt. It's a whole thing. And Moshe took the rod which he had brought away from the chamber of his father-in-law. Fascinating. And it was from the sapphire throne of glory in the weight 40 sign. And upon it was engraven and set forth the great and glorious name by which the signs should be wrought before the Lord by his hand. End quote. I kind of ended our last episode in this series musing over the magical power imbued in this staff to enact these signs before Israel and Pharaoh. And so I thought this was interesting to see how the staff has started to take on a little bit of a life of its own in Jewish mythology, even by around the time of Jesus. One quick note I want to throw in here, because earlier I said that this was Targum Jonathan. I did a quick search just to double check myself on something, and I realized I should have actually said Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. There are two different writings with similar names here. Targum Jonathan is actually for the Nevi'im, which is the writings section of the Tanakh. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan is an Aramaic translation for the Torah. So what I quoted was not from Targum Jonathan, it was from Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. As we move into verse 21, the King James reads, "When you go to return into Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh." But a literal translation would be, "See all the wonders and do them." I don't know that that makes a ton of difference, but I thought it was an interesting translation choice used there. Now I want to pause for a second on the second half of this verse, because it reads, "I will harden his heart," referring to Pharaoh, "that he will not let the people go." This concept of Pharaoh's heart being hardened is a relatively prominent theme in the Exodus narrative, and it's become a little bit of a talking point when it comes to the Bible, because there's a matter of free will versus sovereignty here, where there are some readings of the text that make it seem like God is responsible for hardening Pharaoh's heart. And if that's the case, that sounds like God is impinging on free will. And I remember being in college and having a little bit of a study on this and being taught that, well, actually, throughout most of the passages, you'll see that Pharaoh is the one who is said to harden his heart. We're going to get into that in a minute here, but I want to point out that this is the first time there is mention of Pharaoh having a hardened heart, and God is the one who claims responsibility. So no matter what I say in the next few minutes here, I'm going to offer a few I won't even call them solutions, but a few suggestions on how we could possibly read this text. Regardless of that, there are no easy answers, and there are several different ways that you could read this. People coming from a Calvinist background might read this a little bit differently than I would, but that's okay. There's multiple possible ways we can read this and still be faithful to the text. That's the beautifully frustrating thing about the Bible. It doesn't come with a reader's manual, and there have been faithful Bible-believing, God-fearing people for a couple thousand years now who have read these texts and come to different conclusions. So we have to acknowledge that when we come to something as difficult as this, we need to proceed with a lot of humility. So as we deal with the matter of Pharaoh's heart being hard or God hardening Pharaoh's heart, we really have four possible ways of reading it in my mind. Number one, we could say that God is the one who forced Pharaoh's heart to be hard, that God actually acted against Pharaoh's free will in a way for some greater good so that Israel could leave Egypt, and he hardened Pharaoh against the Israelites to make a point. Second, you could soften that a little bit and say that God didn't necessarily force Pharaoh to do anything, but he pushed him toward it. He encouraged him toward it. With all due respect, as I can say such a sacrilegious thing, this almost presents God as being like the little devil on Pharaoh's shoulder, egging him on to do the wrong thing. In this case, Pharaoh doesn't necessarily have to. God isn't forcing him to do it. He could have chosen not to, but God is, in a sense, tempting him to do that. And I know some of you are going to jump in and say, well, God doesn't tempt anyone with evil. To that, I would point you to 2 Samuel 24, where God specifically moves David to go number the people. And the word behind that is to incite him. God tempts David to go number the people and then punishes him for that. Now, if you're reading the account in Chronicles, it's the Satan who does that, but the Samuel version has God doing it. That's another matter for another day. But I think it goes to show that different biblical authors had different ideas of how much responsibility God had for evil that is done in the world. All right, trying desperately not to get myself off track on that rabbit hole, because we will not be out of that rabbit hole for quite a while if I go down that path. So let's go with option 3 for interpreting this issue of Pharaoh hardening his heart. Third option is that God empowered Pharaoh. So this would not be saying that he encouraged him to do wrong, but rather that he strengthened Pharaoh to make a decision one way or the other, and didn't necessarily push him to do good or to do evil, just strengthened his mindset to be determined one way or the other in whichever decision he makes. We'll talk more about why I would suggest that as an option a little bit later here. Fourth option is that you could just say this was all on Pharaoh. God had nothing to do with this. Pharaoh is the one who hardens his heart. I don't think that option 1 or 4 are valid, because there are different texts within just 5 chapters here that say one or the other. So if you're saying this is all on God, you have to deal with the majority of passages saying that it was actually Pharaoh who hardened his heart. If you say this was all on Pharaoh, you have to deal with the couple of passages that say it was on God. So there's no easy answer here. And let me just give you these instances here to show you what we're working with. This is the first one. This is chapter 4, verse 21, where Yahweh is said to harden Pharaoh's heart. But he says, I will do this. This is going to be in the future. He isn't saying he's done it yet. He's saying he will do it. I should also say, before we go any further, there are actually 3 different words that get used in 5 chapters here, between Exodus 4 and Exodus 9, of Pharaoh's heart being hardened. One is the Hebrew word kasha, and that does have the idea of hardening. There's the Hebrew word hatzak, which means to strengthen, and then there's the Hebrew word kavod, which means to make heavy, or to be heavy. So this one is the instance of strengthening. That's fascinating. There's actually only one instance of that kasha word, the hardening word. The one that actually means hardening is only used once. That's chapter 7, verse 3, where Yahweh says again that I will harden Pharaoh's heart. So it's again a future, but that is the only time where the word actually means to harden. The majority of the instances are actually with the Hebrew word kavod, which means to make heavy. But we do also have a good handful that are to make strong. So chapter 4, verse 21, to make strong. Chapter 7, verse 3 is to harden. Then we have Pharaoh hardening, or really strengthening. It's that hatzak word again. I'm going to do my best to use the actual Hebrew meanings, but I may slip up here since I'm so used to the phrase, hardening the heart. So now that we've put aside the only verse where the harden word is used, kasa in 7:3, I should hopefully be able to do better here with remembering not to use that word. So 7:13 is hatzak, again, to make strong. That's the word used here in this chapter that we're in. 7:22, Pharaoh strengthens his heart again, same word. Some translations will say he wouldn't listen, but it's actually that same word, to strengthen. We have this again in chapter 8, verse 19, where he, again, would not listen, or is strengthened against this. In chapter 9, verse 12, we see this same strengthening word used of Yahweh strengthening Pharaoh's heart. And then in 9:35, Pharaoh strengthens his heart. With the kavod word, that shows up in 7:14, where Pharaoh's heart is heavy, or some translations will say he refused to let the people go. 8:15, where Pharaoh makes his heart heavy again. 8:32, Pharaoh makes his heart heavy again. 9:7, Pharaoh makes heavy, but a lot of translations will say he didn't send away, but it's that same idea. 9:34, he and his servants have a heavy heart. So those are all the instances in these 5 chapters of Pharaoh having a hardened heart. 3 different words, 12 different uses across 5 chapters. And there is a really helpful chart of this all. I know it was probably kind of confusing just hearing me say it. It would make more sense to see it in front of you. So I'll see if I can link this up on the show notes, or at very least send you the link to the document. It was created by Carmen Imes for her Exodus overview class with Bible Project. Going back to this first instance in chapter 4, every English version that I could find, aside from Young's literal translation, had that God either hardened Pharaoh's heart or made him stubborn. Now here's what's really frustrating to me. This particular Hebrew word, hatzak, is very common. It shows up about 290 times in the Tanakh. And the only times that the King James translators translate it as hardened are all in relationship to Pharaoh. 13 times the King James translated this word as hardened, and they are all in reference to Pharaoh. In no other passage and of no other person do they choose to translate this word as harden. In fact, this is the same word from Joshua 1:6, to be strong and of a good courage. It's to strengthen, to be strong. So this is another instance where I think theological bent gets in the way of good translation. And there are a couple hundred other passages here where they are translating it as strong, strengthen, repair, prevail, encourage, be of good courage, take hold, and many other things. I don't presume to know the motivations of why the King James translators chose this particular word in these particular verses, but the majority of them did lean Calvinistic in their doctrine. So I can't help but think that it kind of came out of the overflow of their idea of how God works with people in the world, when I don't think that is the most accurate way. Well, it's not a matter of thinking. I mean, this is the dictionary definition. It doesn't really mean to harden, it means to strengthen here. Now, we still have that one instance where the actual hardening word is used, and we'll get to that in chapter 7. But for now, we're talking about God's making Pharaoh's heart strong. When read that way, I think it makes a crucial difference in the passage, because then you don't have God hardening Pharaoh's heart, rather you have him strengthening Pharaoh, giving Pharaoh courage to make a decision at this crucial decision point in his life. And what happens is Pharaoh takes that additional courage and makes the wrong decision with it. Robert Alter adds in these thoughts: Pharaoh is presumably manifesting his own character. Callousness, resistance to instruction, and arrogance would all be implied by the toughening of the heart. God is not so much pulling a marionette's strings as allowing, or perhaps encouraging, the oppressor king to persist in his habitual harsh willfulness and presumption. End quote. Another instance right here in this verse where I think the King James translation actually gets in the way of what the Hebrew text is saying is where it says, I will harden his heart that he shall not let the people go. Nearly every translation I could find, so in all fairness, this isn't actually just a King James thing, it's an English translation thing. Nearly every translation I could find says that or so that. So they're giving a purpose clause to this. I will harden his heart so that, for the purpose that, what? He won't let my people go. But there is no word there for that. There are ways Hebrew could express a relative pronoun like a that or a which, and it's not here. It's just the conjunction that's often and. So a literal reading of the verse would be, I will strengthen his heart and he won't send out the people. This is the difference between correlation and causation, and it is a huge difference when we're talking about theology here. That simple translation choice made by so many English translations to say that or so that gives a purpose clause here where there is none. It is driving a motivation behind God's action that isn't there. It's saying, I want him to not let my people go so that, implied, I can then do all of these horrible things in the plagues. So therefore, I am going to harden his heart. But that's not what the text says. It's just, I will strengthen his heart and he won't send out the people. So it's not necessarily saying a cause and effect here. It's not saying he won't send out the people because I hardened his heart. It's more of a prediction than a causation, saying I'm going to do this and I'm telling you he's not going to do that. Two other things I think we need to take into consideration when we're talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Number one is a literary element to this. In the earlier parts of the book, we read that Pharaoh imposed heavy labor on the people, and so now we have him being heavy-hearted. Granted, the actual heavy word kavod isn't going to show up until chapters 7 through 9, but I think we can import in the idea that just as Pharaoh made the people's labor heavy, so now his heart is heavy. So that's a neat little literary correlation going on there. There's also a cultural aspect that I don't really see a lot of people bringing out, but I think is crucial if we want to understand what's actually going on here with this passage. Central to ancient Egyptian mythology and belief is the concept of ma'at. M-A, usually an apostrophe, and then an A-T. And it's the concept of having a truth or balance to life. There was supposed to be balance in the cosmos, and part of the pharaoh's role was to maintain this balanced order to the world, this creation order of ma'at. And so when a person would die, I believe this goes for all people. I'm not an Egyptologist, so if anyone knows better, feel free to correct me here. I don't believe this was just for pharaohs. It was for all people, but it included pharaohs. When they died and entered into the afterlife, the god Osiris would weigh their heart against a feather. And this was how they would determine the person's role in maintaining ma'at, whether they caused more harm to the creation order or whether they helped to keep it balanced. So I think this might actually be the most important piece of information for understanding what these passages are talking about when they describe Pharaoh having a hardened or heavy or even strengthened heart. It's the biblical authors coming in and saying, we know your mythology, we know what you think it takes for a person to have a reward in the afterlife, and we're going to co-opt that and say that this Pharaoh was so evil that he would be weighed against the Ma'at order, that his heart was too heavy. Oh, I love that. It's so cool. It's just yet another example of how we get so caught up in these theology debates of free will versus sovereignty and similar matters, saying, well, did God force Pharaoh to do this, or did Pharaoh do this himself? And we miss the amazing tie-ins to the culture of the Bible. Now, I'm not saying those theology debates aren't important, but I think at the end of the day, there's nuance and complexity in this text to show that sometimes the supernatural realm can influence events in this life. But most of the time, it's the things that we do to each other that actually cause good or evil. And that's why, while there are a few passages that describe God's influencing Pharaoh one way or the other, the majority of the verses describe Pharaoh doing this to himself, because that's really what happens most of the time. It's not a devil made me do it situation, or even a God made me do it situation. It's we chose this. Verse 22 introduces us to the concept of the firstborn, and I guess technically I should say introduces us here in the book of Exodus, because the firstborn status is mentioned all the way back in Genesis, particularly in the story of Jacob and Esau. This is something that can be a little hard for modern Westerners to understand because we don't have quite the same cultural connotation that people in the ancient Near East did. Today we try to treat all children equally regardless of birth order. However, there is still a little bit of an idea that the firstborn, particularly if they're a son, may take over, say, the family business or have the role of mediating an inheritance if the parents pass, or maybe they get the house that the parents were in, something like that. We still have a little bit of this concept of a firstborn status, but it was much more significant back then. And it wasn't just about birth order or favoritism. It was actually a status of inheritance. So while this status of firstborn did come with certain privileges in the ancient Near East, it also came with quite a bit more responsibility, and the reality that you probably wouldn't get any say in what you would do with your life because you were expected to take over as your parents dictated. Now, this isn't an episode on the concept of firstborn status in the ancient Near East, so I don't want to go too deep into it. But one thing that I do want to point out is that this use of the word firstborn implies that there are other children. You wouldn't necessarily say that I am the firstborn son of my parents because I'm actually an only child. So there's really no reason to call me firstborn when I'm the only one born from my parents. So I think there's a significant theological insight here that we can easily miss. And it's that if God says Israel is his firstborn, that implies he has other children as well. And if we look into Jewish tradition, we'll see that even Egypt was viewed as one of God's children. So we read these texts from the protagonist's perspective. We read through the mindset of an ancient Israelite because that is the way the texts were written. But Jewish tradition encourages us to actually consider the Egyptian perspective as well, and how painful it must have been for God to act against one of his own children, using that in the collective sense to refer to Egypt as a whole, to act against his children in Egypt who were harming one of his other children, Israel. In fact, and I'm going to spoil a little bit here because this is when we get to chapter 15, but there is a Jewish tradition that when we get to the crossing of the Reed Sea and there's the Song of the Sea where the Israelites celebrate their crossing out of Egypt, the tradition states that the angels wanted to sing along in celebration as well, and God actually stopped them from celebrating because of the human lives lost in the crossing of the Reed Sea. I think this is a really good reminder for us in such polarizing times that we are not the only people that God cares about, that Christians are not the only people that God cares about, that America is not the only people that God cares about, that Republicans or Democrats or people who look like us or go to the same church or of the same denomination as us, they're not the only people that God cares about. We are not the only ones who get to claim the status child of God. Therefore, you need to be careful how we treat other people. I also want to take a second and critique a common Christian idea that Jesus initiated the tradition of referring to God as Father. More than once growing up in church, I heard preachers say that Christians often call God Father. We pray to God as Father. And that comes from how Jesus had his relationship with God as a father. But that's not something you find with the Jews in the Old Testament. This is a distinctly Christian thing, that we see this personal relationship with God that the Old Testament Jews never had. Well, that is just patently untrue and honestly bordering on what I hope is subconscious and unintentional anti-Semitism. Because passages like this go to show that this idea of a father and child relationship between God and his people goes all the way back into the Tanakh, into the Old Testament. Right here in Exodus, we have God referring to Israel as his son, his child, and he then being their father. So this was not something novel with Jesus. And that's not taking anything away from Jesus or saying he's less special for that. I mean, I certainly think that he exemplified the way that we can view God as Father and have this personal relationship with him. But Jesus was a first century Jew, and he was drawing on ideas that were within his own culture and religious beliefs. So this is not something that started with Jesus. This is something that goes all the way back, where Jewish people throughout millennia now have viewed God as a parent. One other point I want to make as we pivot into the part that you've all been waiting for is that the way this verse is structured makes it sound like this is part of God's message to Pharaoh through Moses. If we're reading verses 22 and 23 together, verse 23 is part of the message starting in verse 22, where God said, "You will say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, even my firstborn, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me.'" It's part of the message of verse 22. And as I've stated several times, the original manuscripts would not have had chapter and verse divisions. But the way that this is broken up in English with a verse division between verses 22 and 23 creates what I think is even a little bit of foreshadowing of what is about to happen. I don't want to spoil too much, but we're going to get into a situation where Moses' son almost dies. And so I think that the way that this is laid out in English almost makes us question as well, when God says, "Let my son go," is he solely referring to Israel in his message to Pharaoh? Or is this also a little bit of foreshadowing of what's to come? And maybe there's a little bit of this message to Moses, oh, let my son go, let your son go, that he may serve me. I realize that may sound a little weird since we haven't actually gotten into that part of the story yet. So I think I've kept you waiting long enough. Let's get into this wild and crazy story of on-the-fly circumcision. Alright, strap in, because this is about to get really complicated really fast. Reading in verse 24. It came to pass by the way in the inn that Yahweh met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet, and said, "Surely a bloody husband you are to me." So he let him go. Then she said, "A bloody husband you are because of the circumcision." We'll stop there and do the remaining verses at the end. I warned you it was going to be a strange passage, and a little bit confusing too. So let's talk about what we know here. We have Moses leaving Midian, going back to Egypt. He has taken his family with him. God has sent them, so as far as we know, Moses is doing what God wants for him. And then apparently they stop at this inn. And it says there that Yahweh met him and sought to kill him. Now, this is where we get into one of the big problems with this passage, and it's the ambiguity. There is a lot of just him and he here, where it's not clear who is acting and who is being acted on. So when we have Yahweh met him and sought to kill him, well, we're assuming Moses, since that's who we've been talking about here. The other characters haven't been brought into the narrative yet. But when it says that Zipporah, that's Moses' wife, took a sharp stone, cut off the foreskin of her son, and cast it at his feet, we have to ask, did she cast this at her son's feet, at Moses' feet, at Yahweh's feet who came to kill them? And then that brings us back to the previous verse and causes us to ask, when it says Yahweh met him and sought to kill him, is that Moses, like we assumed, or is this possibly Moses' son, since the solution has apparently something to do with Moses' son? And then when it says, so he let him go, again, is this God letting Moses go? God letting Moses' son go? Like, we don't really know here. There's a lot of ambiguity, and some translations will actually try to put in proper names here. Like, it might say, it came to pass by the way in the inn that Yahweh met Moses and sought to kill his son, or sought to kill Moses. And I get what they're trying to do there, but anything they do is going to be a translation choice, because it's not clear. This is not something that looking at the original Hebrew is going to clear up for us. So I think there may be a little bit of intentional ambiguity on the text. I think the authors may have wanted us to wrestle over this passage. And so putting in specific names into a translation could possibly remove part of an intentional ambiguity. So let's just take this beat by beat, see what we can figure out of what's going on here, see if we can make any sense of this. I'm hoping by the end of this I'll actually be able to lend some clarity for once to what's going on, rather than complicating it as I usually do. This is a case where the Bible is complicated enough, and I get to hopefully not simplify it, but explain it in a way that makes it seem not quite as complex. Some scholars would argue that this is basically the climax of Moses' story, because from this point on, the story isn't so much about Moses as a person anymore. It becomes more about Israel and Moses as he represents them and represents God. So in chapters 2 through 4, we have focused pretty much solely on Moses, and the focus is going to expand out once we get into chapter 5. So as weird as this story is, it's kind of a climax to Moses' character arc so far. As we look in verse 24 and see that it came to pass by the way in the inn, we are met with yet another random detail that signals to us we should be considering how might this tie into previous stories. And sure enough, the last time characters stopped by an inn was when Joseph's brothers found the gold cup in their sack when they were leaving Egypt, going back to their father in Canaan. That was also the last time in the biblical story that a donkey showed up. Now, I did mention before that the last time someone was riding on a donkey was Abraham's test with Isaac at Mount Moriah. But there is an instance of a donkey being laden down with goods to take back to Canaan when Joseph's brothers leave. So I would argue that those facts put together signal to us that this story is somehow meant to connect back to Joseph's story, or to be read in light of Joseph's story. And in that passage back in Genesis, Joseph's brothers had to decide if they would continue living in this selfish manner that they had been before, or if they would change and live in step with the covenant of their father Jacob. Moses is here faced with that same decision. So the authors are subtly signaling to us that another test is about to happen. And as God comes to meet Moses and his family, we see a little bit of a parallel of how Aaron will come to meet them as well. It's also kind of similar to the wording in the Balaam story, where Balaam is yet again on a donkey, go figure, and he is confronted with a supernatural figure who is giving him a test to change his ways. So when we look at these remaining verses, there's really 4 big questions that we have to ask. Number 1, who almost died? Number 2, why is a walk-in circumcision the answer to whatever the problem is? Number 3, why does throwing the foreskin at whoever it gets thrown at solve anything? What is the purpose of that? And 4, what does the phrase bridegroom of blood mean? As you can likely imagine, there are several different interpretations of this passage, and I have to admit, more than one of them are legitimate. Here's how I personally think makes the most sense, and we'll talk a little bit about why. I think the best way to read this would be to say that when they came to the inn, Yahweh met Moses and tried to kill Moses. Zipporah, his wife, comes in with a knife, cuts off the foreskin of her son. She circumcises her son, who is well past the normal age for circumcising at this point, takes that bloody foreskin and throws it at her husband Moses' feet and says, "You are a bloody husband." And then God lets them all go. So that's how I personally read it. That still leaves a lot of questions unanswered, though. Like, why was this so severe that God would want to kill Moses? Like, there is nothing in the text before this that says you have to have your son circumcised, or suggesting that there was anything else in between God and Moses. I mean, they were just communicating on Sinai. You would think there would be some clear communication of an issue if there was one. This just seems to come completely out of the blue. And then to have his wife, of all people, to step in, perform a circumcision on a kid that could have been anywhere from 1 to 40 years old, and then throw the bloody foreskin at her husband, it still has a lot of questions that don't really seem to have an obvious answer. I think you could definitely say that there's an issue of identity going on here. The last 40 years have been an identity crisis for Moses, and there's frequent references in these first couple chapters to family, specifically brothers. Moses would have considered his brothers to be Egyptians for most of his life. And it's even likely that the prince of Egypt, who would now be Pharaoh, was his stepbrother, almost. So when God is about to demand the life of the Egyptians who are continuing the abuse through that very same stepbrother, the new Pharaoh, God needed to know if Moses was in or out. Circumcision was a sign of covenant inclusion in the family of Abraham. This was a way of signifying that you were part of Israel, not part of Egypt. Moses had to then choose here which family he would be a part of. And the weird thing is, Zipporah actually makes that choice for him. She may have even been the person, 2 chapters back, who called Moses an Egyptian man, but here she chooses to make the family fully Hebrew. So I do think that thought process helps a little bit, but not entirely, because it still leaves some questions unanswered, not to mention the fact that, as far as we can tell, it seems like ancient Egyptians, at least in some dynasties, and again, we don't know which dynasty this was occurring under, but some dynasties of ancient Egypt actually circumcised as well, so it may not have been as much of a distinctive thing as just tying back to the covenant. Some scholars will point out that this is here because of literary parallelism, and there's definitely something to that, because the way the book of Exodus is structured, there's a lot of symmetry, and this incident of being saved by blood then later matches Israel's Passover event where they are saved by blood as well. So we have yet another instance of Moses' life foreshadowing what is going to happen to Israel. So that's definitely something that's going on here, but it doesn't explain all of the strangeness in the passage. And particularly, if the issue is Moses' kid not being circumcised, for whatever reason that may have been, why does her doing this and then throwing the foreskin at Moses solve the issue? Well, I'm going to read a little bit of a lengthy quote here from Michael Morales' book, Exodus Old and New. I think it helps us to understand a bit more of what's going on. He writes, "While several ambiguities make this text particularly difficult, the scenario appears to involve God's death threat to Moses, who is spared through the circumcision of his son, with the blood of circumcision applied to Moses' feet. In the Palestinian Targum, an Aramaic translation and expansion of the biblical text dated to the early centuries of the Christian era, Zipporah exclaims that the blood of circumcision saved her husband from the hand of the destroying angel, which is a clear allusion to Passover. The pattern of a divine death threat avoided through the application of blood surely does bring us into the realm of Passover theology. The only other use of the verb for to strike within Exodus 1 through 15, and just me stepping in here for a second, this is in verse 25. What the King James has as cast it at his feet, talking about the bloody foreskin, is literally to strike. So this is a very forceful, she is throwing this bloody foreskin at Moses' feet. I'll also just throw in here, feet is often a euphemism in the Bible for genitals, so that's a whole other dimension that we have to add into this discussion of whether it was getting some blood on Moses' feet or on Moses' feet. Continuing on with Morales. The only other use of this verb for to strike within Exodus 1 through 15 happens to be found in the Passover instructions to strike the lintel and the two posts of the door with blood, and that's in Exodus 12:22. If we widen our view within the proper context, moreover, then Yahweh seeking to kill Moses, or possibly his son, depending on interpretation, follows immediately after Yahweh's message to Moses for Pharaoh. Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. I say to you, send forth my son that he may serve me. But if you refuse to send him forth, look, I myself will slay your son, your firstborn. Now, Morales is getting into something interesting there that I tried to pull out a little bit earlier, of there might be a dual meaning behind that message, where yes, it's to Pharaoh, but there's also a little bit of a message in there to Moses. Continuing on. As noted earlier, Yahweh's message to Pharaoh regarding Israel as his firstborn son summarizes the Exodus deliverance in terms of redeeming God's firstborn son from death, and serves as an ominous foreshadowing of the Passover destruction of Egypt's firstborn sons. Participating in the Passover redemption from such death would require Israel's sons to be circumcised. The foreshadowing of Passover, therefore, relates not only to Yahweh's message, but should also include Moses' intense near-death experience with Yahweh. Remarkably, then, Moses had experienced a Passover deliverance himself even before the plagues in Egypt had begun. As Israel's mediator, Moses was also Israel's forerunner in deliverance. End quote. I definitely appreciate some of what Morales is drawing out there, but I still think that response falls a little bit short, because there is nothing in the text where God says you have to be circumcised for me to save you out of Egypt. Even during the plagues, when we get to the last plague where they have to put the blood on the doorpost, that was the requirement, was the blood on the doorpost. There was nothing that said everyone has to be circumcised. In fact, it was possible, if the Egyptians had put blood on the doorpost, that their house could have been saved. And we find later on, once Israel's wandering in the wilderness, that there is a time where circumcision is instituted for anyone who was not circumcised in Egypt. So this still feels a little bit out of place to me, especially given that there was no direct command for Moses or his son to be circumcised. So I personally don't think this was about Moses' son. Now, like I mentioned earlier, we're not told how old he was at this time. So I think he may have been a little bit younger, leaning into childhood. And I think the real issue was Moses perhaps not being circumcised. Now, we don't know for sure whether or not he was. The Bible doesn't say that one way or the other. And like I mentioned, there were certain Egyptian dynasties that did circumcise. So we don't know for sure if he would have been, since he grew up with his Hebrew family until the time that he was weaned from his mother. So, that would have normally been a time for circumcision there. But if they didn't do that, it's still possible he could have been in the Egyptian court. But I am going to go out on a limb and say that based on the way this story is structured, I think the implication is that Moses actually was not circumcised, and God wanted the leader of his covenant people to have this sign of the covenant. But because Moses was so much older, a circumcision would have incapacitated him for the role that he was about to have to do, especially since he was going to have to travel from Midian to Egypt. That would hurt if you had just gone through a circumcision. So I think the reason that Zipporah circumcises her son is actually because it would have been too painful for it to happen to Moses. So what she does by circumcising her son is actually a circumcision by proxy for Moses. And that's why we have the really weird part about her striking Moses' feet with the bloody foreskin. I know this is weird, and it might make some of you uncomfortable, but I am actually leaning into the interpretation that feet here would mean genitals. That she actually pulled up Moses' robe, and not that she threw a bloody foreskin at his feet, but actually at his penis. She was then symbolically circumcising her own husband before God. And this is where the bit about a bloody husband you are to me comes in as well. Some scholars believe that there was an ancient Near Eastern custom where a father-in-law would perform a circumcision on his soon-to-be son-in-law. Now, I am not a scholar of Arabic, but I have heard some state that the Arabic word for father-in-law is actually related to the same word for circumciser, indicating how a future father-in-law in that culture would occasionally circumcise his son-in-law. That sounds really weird to us today. At least it should sound really weird to us today. I, for one, am very thankful that was not part of our wedding ceremony when I got married. I love my father-in-law, but we just don't have that kind of relationship, you know? And where this all ties in together into this story is that where the King James says a bloody husband you are, the word actually technically doesn't mean husband. It is more specifically the word bridegroom, a new groom, somebody who is getting married very soon. Or even more specifically, a son-in-law. It's the Hebrew word katan, spelled with the exact same syllables as koten, the father-in-law word that we saw earlier in the chapter used of Jethro. So there's some sort of an ancient Near Eastern ritual going on here that is very closely tied to family bonds, where Zipporah is saying, you are now a blood relative. She is boldly including herself and her children in this covenant family. So as weird and gross as all of this is, I want to take a minute and just appreciate the incredible woman that Zipporah was. She's pretty much ignored in a lot of Christian writing because, well, she doesn't have a huge part to play in the biblical story. She doesn't show up a ton. But what she does here is so vitally important. I mean, she is responsible for saving Moses' life. Remember back in chapter 1, I said there are 7 women in the first several chapters that go on to save Israel? Well, she's one of them here. If she had not done this, Moses would have died. And then you don't have Israel leaving Egypt the way that we know. The entirety of history here would have changed. And for some reason, Moses apparently was not fitting the expectation God had for him. And if that's the case, that would imply that Jethro perhaps also had not done his expected role to circumcise his son-in-law. So Moses' wife steps in and does that role herself. She is acting as a priestess before Yahweh. She is representing God to Moses and Moses to God. She is an intermediary. She is stepping in and doing exactly what Moses will do for the people later on. She's putting herself in harm's way to say, I am going to make a difference here. I am going to resolve this issue. And it's a messy resolution, but I think there's even an aspect of shaming in her saying this to Moses to say, I did your job. You are supposed to be a priest. You are the Levite, but me, as a daughter of a priest, I am coming in as the priestess here, and I am doing what your God wanted. Now, just for fun, I want to turn again to Targum Pseudo-Jonathan for a second and see how Jewish tradition added on to this story as time went on to try to make sense of it. But it was on the way, in the place of lodging, that the angel of the Lord met him, and sought to kill him, because Gershom his son had not been circumcised, inasmuch as Jethro his father-in-law had not permitted him to circumcise him. But Eleazar had been circumcised by an agreement between them two. And Zipporah took a stone and circumcised the foreskin of Gershom her son, and brought the severed part to the feet of the angel, the destroyer, and said, The husband sought to circumcise, but the father-in-law obstructed him. And now let this blood of circumcision atone for my husband. And the destroying angel desisted from him. So that Zipporah gave thanks, and said, How lovely is the blood of this circumcision, that hath delivered my husband from the angel of destruction. End quote. I would love to hear your thoughts on this passage. And honestly, whichever way you choose to read this, however you choose to interpret this, it is still going to be a difficult passage to wrestle with. But whatever you do, don't leave out Zipporah and the incredible role she played here as a priest before Yahweh. It's really easy to read the Bible as being about in-groups and out-groups, but the very person who was supposed to be God's representative to the people needed somebody from an outside tribe, and a woman, no less. Not another man, but a woman to step in and be his representative before God. She deserves to be remembered for that. Alright, let's quickly wrap up this chapter with the remaining verses. Verse 27. Yahweh said to Aaron, Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went and met him in the mount of God, and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of Yahweh who had sent him, and all the signs which he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which Yahweh had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that Yahweh had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked on their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. Like I mentioned before, biblical passages aren't always linear. Back in verse 20, the text read that Moses returned to Egypt. And then verse 21 had God saying, when you return to Egypt. Now verse 27 has Moses back at the wilderness of Sinai. So remember, this is going to be a little bit more theme-based than time-based. More Chris Nolan movie than linear storytelling. So we have Moses now back at the mountain, so it doesn't necessarily mean that he traveled back there, but that we're kind of going back in time to that. And we have God saying to Aaron to go into the wilderness. We talked before about how that word wilderness doesn't mean jungle, and it doesn't even necessarily mean desert, it just means uninhabited area. So he's telling him to go out that way to meet Moses. We don't know when exactly God sent Aaron there, or how Aaron got away from Egypt to do that, but apparently he did. And he goes and he meets his brother at what is called the mountain of God. So again, we have that terminology being used without any explanation. And he kissed him. That was an accepted form of greeting in the ancient Near East, not usually on the lips, more so a kiss on the cheek sort of thing, like you might imagine from a stereotypical like Frenchman in a movie or something like that. You know, the on either side of the cheek, yeah, that kind of thing. Ancient Near Eastern greeting. Totally acceptable. Nothing Alabama or West Virginia going on there. Moses recaps everything that's been going on to him. I would love to hear how that conversation went and what they needed to catch up on, whether or not they had been in communication before, whether or not this was their first meeting since they had been kids. Like, there's so much I would love to know that the biblical text just doesn't include here. And when it says they go to the elders, that could be age, saying the oldest people there, but it's also a term just used of the leader of a group, kind of like how there are certain churches that say they have an elder board. It's not necessarily the oldest people in the church, it's leaders of the church. So there's definitely a correlation where a lot of times the people leading the tribe were older ones, but it doesn't necessarily just mean solely old people. So then Moses recounts all of this again, this time to the elders. He shows them the signs, and verse 31 literally reads that they kneeled and bowed. The King James just says they bowed their heads in worship, but it's literally they kneeled and bowed. Hurting people need tangible evidence of love. They need to know that they are seen. And these people had been hurting for, within the text, 400 years, and they felt like they hadn't been seen. And this shows some validation to their suffering. Alright, that was chapter 4. I told you it would be weird. I'd love to hear from you. Reach out via email, on our website, social media, on our Discord, and let's keep the conversation going on this chapter. There's a lot to talk about, and a lot of different ways that the text could be read. So I always love hearing from you, and I hope to soon for this episode. Next time, we will be in Exodus 5, discussing the first time Moses and Aaron confront Pharaoh, and how and why things go wrong really quickly. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.